Hi everybody. I got the power. I got the power. I love the power. I love the power. La 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 la.
Hello, Nashville Software School students. This video is going to be an introduction to getting some command line tools installed for your C# coursework. It's going to walk you through building your very first application, and I will introduce you to some of the basics of the C# language because it is very different from JavaScript, what you've learned so far. So I'm just going to describe some of the key terms just so you're familiar with the vocabulary as your instructor goes through this with you. Something that Microsoft is getting on board with, that all the open source software communities do, which is really getting the developers to work on the command line. So what I'm going to show you here is how to get a command line utility that's going to give you some boilerplate code for a couple of different types of projects that you're going to be learning how to do in the course. So I'm here at my favorite search engine of DuckDuckGo. You can use Google, whatever you want. So we're going to do a search term of ASP.NET generator. I'm going to do a search on that. And here we go. It's this one right here. There's OmniSharp/generator ASP.NET. So let's go to that real quick. And if you scroll down, you'll see some instructions right here. So we're going to follow along with these. I've already done these. Follow these instructions on getting started. Basically, you already have Node. If you haven't installed it on the front end, make sure you get Yeoman installed, which is that second one right there. You're going to use Bower. You should have that, absolutely. And then you're going to install the generator. So I already have it installed, but I'll type it in anyways. Generator-ASP.NET. Oops. This will take a minute to download. I'm going to skip over this for the purpose of the video. I'll be right back. Okay, I've got it installed. And then once you have Yeoman installed, here's all you have to do. Yo, which is the command line utility for Yeoman, and then ASP.NET. Once you type this in, it's going to provide you a list of possible projects that you can build. Here we go. So we're going to start off with a console application. The simplest kind of application you can build in C#. I'm going to pick this. Don't pick F# if that shows up for you. It probably won't. Make sure you don't. Just pick console application, hit enter. It's going to give us a kind of a sample name for our application. I'm just going to leave it at this. Basically what this is going to do is going to create this directory for you and then put all the sample code inside of it. So I'm just going to use that. You can call this whatever you want. There we go. It says what it created. It gave us a gitignore, a program.cs. That is going to be our source code, and a project.json, very much like when you worked with node modules. They give you a project.json, which allowed you to write custom scripts, and it kept track of all the dependencies that were for your application. With this new .NET Core, project.json does serve that same purpose, and it even gives a step on what to do next. I'm going to follow those steps. So that's the directory that it created for us. The first thing we have to do is .NET restore, and what that does is restore all of the dependencies that are specified in project.json. So actually, before I do that, let me clear my screen. Let's look at what's inside project.json. I'm just going to cat it. There we go. It's a JSON object, just like it was with NPM. You know, gives us tells us what version of the framework we're on. I'm running 1.0. Build options, you don't have to worry about that right now. But here's some dependencies, much like you saw in your project.json for NPM. You know, its dependencies is just the generic .NET Core app platform, the entire platform. Tells us what frameworks we're going to use. DNX Core, that's their internal name for the .NET Core framework. And then our default namespace is console application. We'll get to namespaces a little bit later, but basically that's a way to organize your code, not on the physical file system, but a way to organize code into large groups in a project. All right, so here we have some dependencies. So to install these dependencies, we have to say .NET restore. All right. Next thing we're going to try to do is run this project. There's actually two steps. What it does is a .NET build. Basically, it compiles the project. And your instructions will talk to you about compiling, and I'll just give you a brief introduction to what it does here. So a .NET run will actually build the project first and then execute it. So just to see how it works, let's go ahead and try it. .NET Run. Okay, here it's compiling it. It says in green, compiling succeeded. Time elapsed. What is that? 02.79 seconds. So there we go. Our very first running of a C# program. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is fire up this code in Visual Studio Code. I can do that right from the command line. Your instructors will show you how to get this running from the command line. So load up code with the current directory of code. There we go, Visual Studio Code. So here's what's going to happen when you first load a program that you kind of initialized. It's going to tell us right away when you have Visual Studio Code open, required assets to build and debug are missing from the console application. So what Visual Studio Code provides us is a way to actually debug this program. Much the way that in the front end, if you put a debugger statement in JavaScript, or you put a breakpoint in Chrome when you have the debugger tools open, you can do the exact same thing in a C# program. You can pause the code at a certain point and see what the value of all the variables are and see how your code is executing. So I'm going to go ahead and just click yes here to get all those tools installed. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the program.cs. .cs is the extension for C#. There we go. Let's look at some of the terminology here. We've got a using statement. Basically, in the .NET framework, it's an enormous framework with lots of libraries built into it, lots of default tools and classes and all kinds of things that are available to you to use in your program. So one thing we do at the top of every class that we define here, we say what part of the .NET framework are we going to use in our code? And basically what it does is imports it to be able to be used in our code. We can use all of the tools and utilities in these namespaces that we're specifying. So in this case, by default, it says using system, a lot of system tools, like being able to write to the console, systems.collections.generic. We're not using any yet, but basically those are collections like arrays. Okay, system.link, you'll get to that in a little bit. Link is a way to actually work with collections of data. And system.threading.tasks, basically you can have multiple tasks running at the same time. The reason they are underlined with that green squiggly line, when you see that in code, it means you're not actually using those tools and utilities in your code. You specified that you want to use them, but the green line says you're not actually using them. It's almost like a warning. The namespace, I mentioned that earlier. This is just a way to organize your code in a C# program. And you'll learn that as the course goes through. It means nothing. It's not part of the actual running of the program. It's simply a way to kind of consolidate things to a level of encapsulation for organization. All right, the next line down there, I'm looking at line 8. Here's where we actually get to the C# code that's going to make a difference in our program. So public class program. So program is the name of the object we're creating. So C#, object oriented. The class is the blueprint for the object that we're going to create. And the name of that object is going to be program. So classes are blueprints. When you're defining something here, you're not actually creating an object. You're simply defining what the object will have when you go ahead and create one later. And then public is the accessibility of this. If you remember way back when you learned how to do the IFI in JavaScript, it was a way for you to provide a public interface, because it was really about modularization of your JavaScript code. But you needed some variables that you didn't want other people to have access to. And then out of that IFI, you return an object with getters and setters, which allowed other people to use those getters and setters to change the values of those internal properties, those private properties that you didn't want people to monkey around with. Well, in C#, you actually have to say what the accessibility of something is. And here in public, we're saying this is publicly available. Anybody can create this class. And then we go down to line 10, we have a method here is what we're defining. Here's a public method, meaning anybody can call this. There's no restrictions on this whatsoever. And then we see another word called static. Static means we don't have to create a new object to be able to use this method. Void. When you see the word void or a default type, let me show you what I mean by that. In C#, you can say, well, you have to say what the return type of this method is. Void means this method doesn't return anything, and you actually have to state that. If this method returned an integer, I would have to put int. If it returned a string, same thing, I would have to specify string. Now look at that, as soon as I changed up the word string, it put a red squiggly line under main. So if I hover my mouse over that in code, it'll actually try to give you a hint of why it's complaining, because a red squiggly line means your code will not compile. It's a little bit different from the green underline, which is a warning. When you see that red, it means your code will not compile, I won't run. And here's its little hint. Not all code paths return a value. I said this method returns a string. The compiler looks and says, yeah, buddy, but it's not returning a string, so I won't compile. So we're just going to put this back to the original one, which is void, saying this method doesn't return anything. So when a console application starts, it's looking for a method with a signature of public static void named main. Okay, that's kind of the entry point for a program in C#. So right now it's not doing anything, which if we go back to the command line, when I ran it originally, let me do it again. .NET run. It'll compile, but it doesn't do anything. Okay, so I'm going to actually make it do something. I'm just going to output hello world, the standard thing that you, very first thing you should learn in a new language. Here's how you do it in C#. Console.writeLine. The C in console has to be capitalized. The W and the L have to be capitalized. And let's just give it a string of hello world. And be excited about it, exclamation point. All right, now in JavaScript, you could put a semicolon after your code. It's best practice, but you didn't have to. Well, in C#, you have to. Let's put a semicolon there. I'm going to save my code. So now that I've saved my code, I'm going to try to run it again, which will compile the application. I'll show you the end result of that in a second. Let me run it. There we go. Now it's going to compile. Hey, there's my output. Hello world. It did what I told it to do. So here's what I mean by compiling. Your instructors probably already covered this, but I'm going to show you real quick. In a C# program, in the Microsoft world here, when we're working with the .NET framework, the end result is actually a file on your system. And you're not used to that in the front end. You wrote some JavaScript code, the browser loaded that code, parsed it, and just ran it. You know, there was no file that was run. So I'm actually going to go back to my code here, and you'll see two folders now in my directory, bin and obj. Let me expand out what is being created here. There's a bin, debug, and then this .NET Core app 1.1. In this file, in this directory, you'll see 5 different files. Here's what is actually being executed. This file right here, this console application.dll, that is a compiled file, because our C# code, we're simply defining what should be built, an actual executable file. And so if you're not clear on what that means, again, go back to the front end. You went to the console. When you wanted to start up your web server, what did you type into the command line? HTTP-server. Okay? You were actually executing a file that had instructions inside of it. Well, now you're going to be building files just like HTTP server. Somebody can type it onto the command line, and it'll run the instructions that you have inside of it. It's not being loaded by a browser. It's just executed in the command line environment. Now, the only thing I haven't covered so far is these two words right here inside these parentheses. Now, just like in JavaScript, when you define a function, in C# world, you're going to start calling these methods. It's the right terminology for it. So I'm defining a method here. The name of this method is main. Now, just like in JavaScript functions, you can pass in arguments. And that's what this is right here. It's an argument. These arguments are going to be strings. So everything in C# is going to be typed. You have to specify a type. If I put square brackets after this word of the type, meaning it's going to be a collection of strings. Okay, so I'm basically building an array of strings. And then I'm going to take all of those, and the name of this argument is args. Very different from JavaScript. You didn't have to specify what type of thing something was. You could just do that, right? And JavaScript just magically figured out the type. You could pass in an integer to there, and it just made it an integer. You passed a string in, and it just made it a string. Not so much here. You actually have to specify the type of things that are going to be passed in. So, quick review, starting from the top, the using statement. What parts of the .NET framework do you want to use in your code? Namespace. It's a way to group common types of code together. It's not part of the instructions, but it is a way to encapsulate code, kind of group it together. Then we define our class, the blueprint for an object. What will this object have on it when I create this thing? Okay, you have to give it a name, and this name is called program. We have an accessibility keyword on it. It's public, meaning anybody can access this. Same thing on line 10, public. Anybody can run this method. It's not restricted. Static, meaning I don't require an object actually to be created to run this program or to run this method. Void, what will this method return? Then we have the name, which is main, and then an array of strings can be passed in as the parameters to this method. So there's a very brief introduction to a console application in C#. An introduction to using the command line tools to actually create some boilerplate code for you to get you up and running for a console application. And it showed you how to actually compile a program, see what the end result was, and how to run that program and see its output. So I'm going to show you one more thing before we're done. We've got some very basic code. I ran it for you. You could see the file that was compiled, but I'm going to show you the debugger that Visual Studio Code gives you out of the box. So if you, when you're in this view, if you hit Shift Command D, that takes you to the debug panel here that you see on the left. And at the very top, you'll see the word debug with a green triangle. Okay, that'll start the debugger. It'll start your program in debug mode. So basically, there's another process on your machine that is watching your code run and then giving you output. So just like in Chrome I was saying before, in here you can set breakpoints. Now I only have one line of code in my application, so I'm just going to put a breakpoint. You'll see my code, or my mouse over here, these red dots. If you click right there, I just set a breakpoint. And if you click the green triangle, it'll start this up. And you'll see the breakpoint hit. On a Mac, you will see this message because it does require administrative privileges in order to monitor another task on your system. So go ahead and type your system password here. Okay. Debugger will continue to run. There we go. Now you'll see that this line of code is highlighted in kind of this greenish yellow, I guess is what it is. And over here, my breakpoint now has a little, I guess what you'd call that shape, a chevron or an arrow over it. So my code stopped executing right here. This is how the debugger works. Up here at the top, we have our step over, we have our step into. The red box is obviously to stop the program. This recycle, you can see as I'm hovering over here, it says restart. So if you make changes to the code, you can just go ahead and click the restart. It'll start it up again and break it at the same spot. And again, the green triangle if you just want to keep going from this point on. So I'm just going to click that. And you'll see down here it says hello world. There's my output in debug mode. This is going to be very different from your JavaScript course, but a lot of you will find that the rules, there are a lot of rules when it comes to building C# programs. In JavaScript, a lot of people kind of get lost and they get frustrated, or they think they don't like it because JavaScript, you just kind of do whatever you want. You can morph the language and you can build things in such a way that completely suits you. There are no rules, to be honest, in JavaScript. There are a few minor ones, but you can always find a way to even break those rules. But in C#, the compiler, the thing that's running behind the scenes when I did that .NET run, there's actually another executable that it gets installed, and that executable reads your code and applies a set of rules. And if you break any of those rules, your program will not compile, will not run. Now, some people find those actually liberating. Hey, if I just follow these very clearly defined rules, my program will work. And the compiler is telling me with a red underline, hey, this is broken right here. I won't compile. So that's very easy for me to find out what's going on. In the JavaScript world, that was not easy. It didn't always exactly tell you what was going wrong. So I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to writing C# in Visual Studio Code, seeing how the debugger works, putting some just a quick console write line out there so we can see the output on when we run our program. Got an introduction to some of the terms that are going to be used throughout your C# course here. So we'll see you in class, and I hope you enjoy C#.